In this lecture, we're going to explore how Shakespeare's plays were printed and published during his writing career, which spanned from the early 1590s to 1613. We will also assess how the print industry of early modern London, and its relationship to the theater of early modern London in which Shakespeare worked, conditioned the physical forms that Shakespeare's plays took in print. So let's start with a basic question. How did Shakespeare's plays become printed books, when they were in fact written to be performed in large, open-air theaters seating 3,000 people or more? The most important starting point in any discussion of printing Shakespeare's plays is the issue of authorship and ownership. Today, we think of an author as both the creator and owner of the work that bears her or his name. And after all, copyright law exists to defend the rights of authors to their work. But in Shakespeare's time, the acting company owned the play, not the playwright. A playwright, after all, wrote plays for the company to perform, and so the company retained the rights to the play. For instance, as you can see on this title page of Romeo and Juliet, there is no mention of William Shakespeare at all. Rather, they list the company that performed the play and the person who printed it. So it was the acting company's decision to print the play, and very sensibly they would only print plays if they thought they could make money off of it. This would happen most often in years of plague, when the theaters were forcibly closed by the city government of London. They thought that this could prevent the spread of disease. So theatrical companies would print their plays as an emergency measure during this time to stay solvent. Shakespeare was a member and a shareholder of the Lord Chamberlain's men, which became the King's Men in 1603 when they gained the patronage of King James I. And as shareholder, that means that Shakespeare is part owner of the acting company in which he works and for whom he writes. So he would no doubt have had input regarding the printing of plays, but it's important to remember that this was very much a corporate undertaking rather than an individual one. So let's say that it's 1602. And the Lord Chamberlain's men decide to print and sell copies of Hamlet after having a successful run of it at their newly built Globe Theatre. How would a play then make it from that theatre into print, to be sold at one of the many print shops outside St. Paul's Cathedral? This map illustrates the geographical journey a play would have taken from stage to page in early modern London. In yellow, we see the actual location of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre on the south bank of the Thames River. And outlined here in purple is the churchyard of St. Paul's Cathedral, the center of the London book trade, where bookshops and bookstalls sold printed books. Now, before we move on from here, we need to establish one very important fact, that there is no such thing as original Shakespeare. Now, by original, I mean that none of his first drafts of either a play or of the sonnets exists in his own hand. So for us, when we think of drafts, and even when we go through our own process of writing a paper, say, multiple versions of that exist physically, either, that we print off or that we have on our laptop, and we call that our first draft. There is nothing like this for Shakespeare. In fact, the majority of the documents that we have in his own handwriting are legal ones, including his last will and testament. So now, remembering that, no original Shakespeare, this chart illustrates how the play makes it from Shakespeare's draft through this process to into print. So, we begin here with the foul papers, Shakespeare's actual draft that he writes. He then passes the foul papers off to his acting company, where it's copied out by a professional scribe into fair copy, and very often acting companies employed a person expressly for this purpose. The fair copy then becomes the prompt book, and with the prompt book we start to get actual detailed stage directions, details of sound effects. The prompt book really contains all of the sort of business of actually staging a play. So you can think of the prompt book actually as a rehearsal script. Following this, the prompt book has to be submitted to the Master of the Revels for approval. The Master of the Revels was a government official, who reviewed and very often censored parts of plays or entire plays. Censorship most often happened if the master of the revels deemed aspects of the play blasphemous or treasonous. So the acting company has to get the master of the revels' stamp of approval, and then they can perform their play. And then, and only then, following performance, if the company decides that it's worthwhile to publish it, the play is sent off to the printers. And in this lecture, we don't really have time to get into the actual physical work of the printing press, but if you have questions about that, do bring them to class because it's really an interesting process. And so here on this slide, we have a finished product of all of those processes and steps that we just examined. This is the 1600 edition of A Midsummer Night's Dream. And look here's William Shakespeare listed as the author, right underneath the mention of the Lord Chamberlain's men who acted out the play. So when we start to see Shakespeare's name appear on the printed books, that gives us a sense of his growing popularity during his own career. Now, this actual physical book in front of you has its own sort of technical name. This type of book is known as a quarto. Quarto refers to how the sheet of paper is folded. In this case, it's a sheet of paper folded 2 times. And in fact, if you have a sheet of paper handy, go ahead and fold it twice just to get a sense of sort of what this type of book would have looked like, and that is its base units. So if you have that twice folded sheet of paper, that would have then been stitched together with all of the other twice folded sheets to actually make the physical book. Quartos were the cheaper types of books in the early modern period, and they are easier to handle. You can think of them as the early modern equivalent of a cheap paperback. And usually, if people wanted to save even more money, they could buy quartos unbound, and they could even buy them uncut. So can you, if you made your practice quarto, get a sense of how you would cut the folds to make the actual pages that you turn? So 19 plays of Shakespeare's were published as quartos before his death in 1616. And so for his entire career, these plays constitute Shakespeare's known written work, along with, of course, his sonnets and the longer poems Venus of Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. So again, his plays exist in book form as these cheap individual play texts. But this changes in 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare dies. His colleagues and fellow actors get together and decide to publish the first folio. And a folio, as opposed to the quarto, is a sheet of paper folded only once. The first folio was the first collected volume of Shakespeare's plays, and it contains 36 plays, 18 of which had never before been published. So, as the first collected edition of Shakespeare's works, the first folio is the first time that Shakespeare's canon is sort of created, canon being his body of work. And so, as I said, 18 of these plays had never before been printed and published, and that includes such plays and such fan favorites as Julius Caesar and Macbeth. So without the first folio, those plays would have been lost. More importantly, the first folio, and just folios in general as a book form, were much more expensive books. They're bigger than a quarto, obviously, being folded only once, but the folio form was also reserved for what were considered the most important books, the most sort of precious books. These would have been sort of precious objects, again, because they're expensive. And William Shakespeare's first folio was not just significant in its own time, but it is today considered to be one of the most significant printed books in the English language, right behind the King James Bible, for instance. But, point blank, why does all of this matter, that Shakespeare's plays were published in these 2 different physical forms? Well, if we remember our basic math, almost half of the plays that were published in the first folio had already been published in quarto form. So all of these friends make it into the first folio, but they'd already existed as quartos. And so, again, while this might not seem like a big deal, many of these plays differ significantly in their quarto and folio forms. For example, let's take a look here at two versions of Shakespeare's King Lear. The first is the 1608 quarto version, which was published very likely almost immediately after it was performed, and the 1623 folio version of King Lear. Now, for us, 21st century readers, Shakespeare's King Lear is just one thing. It's one text of a play. It's one play. But look here at just the differences in title between these two. The quarto over here is the chronicle history of the life and death of King Lear and his three daughters, whereas the folio titles the play The Tragedy of King Lear. History and tragedy are two completely different genres in a way. And let's look at even more differences. Here, this quarto version has this sort of long plot summary, giving you details of what the play is about and how it was performed. But the folio just gets right down to business. So let's think about this even from a close reading perspective. How much does your perception of a play change when it is labeled a history? What do you assume the play is about when it's labeled a tragedy? What are the genre associations that come up? So, simply put, the variations between these quartos and folios really do matter because they ask that we think critically about the linguistic or thematic meanings behind textual difference. More importantly, these textual differences ask that we, as careful and close readers of Shakespeare, kind of modify the way that we're trained to think about him as an author. So, in a prefatory sonnet to the first folio, Ben Jonson praised his contemporary and friend William Shakespeare as, quote, not for an age, but for all time. This praise, as nice as it is, creates an image of Shakespeare that is still culturally dominant, that of the lone genius who labors with just pen and ink to create great masterpieces. But, as we now know, Shakespeare never worked alone. Everything that he produced was produced in collaboration with his fellow shareholders and actors, and for one of the plays he wrote to even see the light of day, it had to pass through multiple levels of mediation, possible censorship, and revision. So quartos and folios, as we see in this chart here, serve as possible artifacts of Shakespeare's authorial and theatrical practice. So maybe, there's an initial performance of a play and the acting company isn't exactly happy with how it turns out. So they say, hey, Will, you need to change some things. And Shakespeare revises. Or maybe Shakespeare himself is unhappy with how a play turns out. So he goes back to his work and revises it. So again, this gives us a sense of Shakespeare as a working artist, as a practitioner of drama who revises and makes changes. And when two different copies of a play exist, those versions can often differ quite a bit in terms of content, characterization, plot, or theme. These categories serve as the backbone for our own work of interpretation and analysis. Thus, these variations demand our attention and consideration as responsible scholars of literature. So I am very much looking forward to discussing everything brought up in this lecture in person. And when you have time before we meet, please acquaint or reacquaint yourself with the plot of Hamlet and read through Act 3, Scene 1 in particular. We're going to be focusing on the to be or not to be speech. This is going to give us all a good foundation to discuss that play and Shakespeare more broadly when we meet.